del Congreso Internacional de Ética y Ciudadanía, Trasciende, Perú. Empezaremos con la conferencia Western Values. ¿Are they still valuable? Nuestro ponente es Fray Alban McCoy. Un fuerte aplauso para él, por favor. Fray Alban McCoy es sacerdote franciscano conventual, escritor y académico, autor de An Intelligent Person's Guide to Christian Ethics y An Intelligent Person's Guide to Catholicism. Ha sido profesor de filosofía, capellán católico en la Universidad de Cambridge y decano en St. Edmund College. Actualmente es preelector en Cambridge y profesor visitante en UPC. Un aplauso más, por favor.
Thank you very much for the welcome, and thank you all for your warm welcome. And it's great to be back in my other university, UPC. And thank you to all my friends who are here to lend their moral support. Okay, are Western values still valuable? That's my brief. And this is my answer. Yes, they most certainly are. But I'm equally certain that they are also vulnerable. Indeed, more vulnerable now than ever before. And my certainty rests on the fact that the core value, which lends sense and integrity to all Western values, has over many years now been steadily eroded and is now being abandoned entirely in more and more Western democracies. That core value is the dignity, sacredness, and inviolability of human life, of all human life. Without this foundation, the whole edifice of Western civilization is not just vulnerable, but doomed. Without this foundation, the rule of law itself, with all the rights and freedoms it guarantees, cannot be rationally defended or ultimately sustained. Without that foundation, human rights cease to be natural rights and become rights conferred by society. And without that foundation, the democratic principle itself becomes a liability, not a strength, because what society gives, society can take away. It is now widely denied and often merely forgotten that Western values have their origin in that profound shift in our understanding of what it is to be human that came into the world with Christianity, and which is the foundation of Western civilization. But uncoupled from its core value, Western civilization is in danger of imploding. Now, the inviolability of all human life is rooted not only in Christianity's conviction, which it shares with Judaism, that human beings are all made in the image and likeness of God, but in its belief, which is unique to Christianity, that the Creator entered into his creation as a human being, so that we might not just image his nature, but share his life. And so, as a consequence, every human being is destined in body and soul for resurrection and eternal life. Now, this radical transformation in our understanding of what it is to be human, which affirmed the infinite value of every human being's life, was revolutionary, and until Christianity, entirely unknown. In the ancient world, nobody thought that every human life was sacred, precious, and inviolable. Fathers had the right in certain circumstances to kill their own children. Masters had the right in practically any circumstance to kill their slaves. Crowds flocked to see criminals and prisoners of war killing each other in the theatres to provide entertainment for the masses. Wholesale massacre was a normal tool of war, and involuntary suicide at the whim of the emperor was a commonplace. It's true that some ancient philosophers defended an abstract theory of human equality, but they were untroubled by the facts of life on the ground. In practice, life was cheap and expendable. The philosophically sophisticated aspiration to human flourishing and the possibility of peace and prosperity applied only to the few. Savagery, for the rest, in its various forms, was the norm. But Christianity introduced the entirely novel conviction that all human beings are equally precious and that all human beings were made to flourish. No one was excluded or forgotten, and human value couldn't be extinguished even by decree or by death. Christians, of course, often failed to adhere to this vision, sometimes outrageously, as in the case of slavery, for instance, which was, of course, eventually abolished, albeit only relatively recently, by Christians, or capital punishment, which the Catholic Church now condemns, but formally approved. But the sacredness of life in all its stages, nevertheless, became the source of a whole panoply of values that until recently we in the West took for granted and regarded as irreversible, such that societies were judged to be civilized or not, according to whether or not they adhered to these principles. But what had once seemed irreversible has now sadly gone into reverse. How did this come about? How did this come to pass? It would be far too simplistic to suggest that there is a direct correlation between the erosion of Western values and the decline in Christianity. The connection is more nuanced. What we have experienced in this era is what one author has called the domestication of transcendence, by which he means the loss of a perspective that encompasses both living and dying, which has been displaced now by a relativized, enclosed, virtual world that insulates us from any sense of objective reality. Reality is what we choose to endorse. And so there are few grounds for surprise that we have arrived at where we find ourselves. Unlike any age before, we are deluged by a ceaseless flood of information, opinions, novel ideas, and life-changing developments in practically every sphere of life. And under the influence and specious authority of all-pervasive social media, 24-hour news feeds, and vacuous celebrity opinion, so much of this is embraced without any critical scrutiny whatever, and not even a test of utility. Unsurprisingly, this welter of ever-changing ideas has given rise to confusion, disorientation, intellectual torpor, and intellectual anarchy, and has rendered us vulnerable to disinformation, misinformation, and downright lies. Relativism has pulled the rug from under any serious effort to search for truth, and the pursuit of profit, pleasure, and prosperity have become the defining goals in this virtual world. Of course, all of this has been brewing for long before the present era. Even as the West's unparalleled hegemony was being celebrated, ambivalence about Western values and the very idea of Western civilization itself was becoming more and more evident. It is now not unreasonable to conclude that Westernization was only skin deep and damagingly eclectic. Critics now fashionably cite the West's failings as the principal source of the world's problems. Evidence of its alleged bankruptcy, according to critics, includes colonialism, imperialism, racism, elitism, gender inequality, economic exploitation, environmental degradation, and global poverty. The very idea of the West, it's claimed, was a late 19th century invention to justify British imperial expansionism and violent colonial expropriation. Those, on the other hand, who seek to defend Western values as an overall source of benefit to humankind cite democracy, the rule of law, human rights, personal autonomy, freedom of speech, freedom of association, capitalism's ability to alleviate poverty, technology's ability to improve healthcare, increase productivity and prosperity, environmentalism, and feminism, to name but a few. But both positions are wide of the mark. What both leave out is the critical core value on whose adoption or abandonment depends the continuing existence or eventual demise of Western civilization, namely the wholly innovative and revolutionary conviction that every human life is sacred, that every human person enjoys a dignity that is God-given, not legally conferred, that every human life matters, and that every human life, including the unborn, the deranged, the handicapped, and the terminally ill, has an inalienable right to life. Only in the West, founded on a unique and extraordinary confluence of the speculative legacy of antiquity and the revolutionary religious orientation and transformed sensibility of Christianity, did this belief become authentically universalist and achieve real, if imperfect, expression in the form of Christendom. Now, there is, however, a counterclaim. In an account clean contrary to the one I'm proposing, secularists often claim that Western values came to full fruition only when they were unshackled from Christianity, when people felt free to question religious authority. Western values, so the argument goes, emerge into the light only with the Enlightenment, when reason comes of age and finally triumphs over superstition. On this account, the true originating creed and the only trustworthy guardian of Western values is secular humanism. Now, it is unfortunate that the term humanism has been appropriated by secularists, such that now it is almost exclusively associated with atheism. The word, which appeared in English in the 16th century, was first used to describe a renewed interest in classical literature, giving rise to the so-called New Learning, which included a renewed emphasis on the Christian Gospels, read for the first time for 1,000 years in the original language. Such distinguished and influential figures as Desiderius Erasmus and Thomas More were described as humanists, because alongside their theological learning, they pioneered a renewed emphasis on the dignity and the potential of humankind. And of course, the locus classicus for this Renaissance re-evaluation and re-elevation of human nature is Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man, composed in 1486. But that itself is firmly anchored in a deeply spiritual and theological framework. But when the term first came into currency, there was no suggestion that humanism was intrinsically anti-religious. Even later, among anti-clerical freethinkers, skeptics, and atheists of the late 18th century, it was not assumed to necessarily involve an anti-religious bias. That assumption arose only in the late 19th century, when the Middle Ages came to be thought of as a dark interlude between the classical and Renaissance enlightened ages, and when Darwinism seemed to many to undermine the traditional Christian beliefs about creation and the origins of humankind. But in its original sense, humanism was of a piece with an understanding of human beings as divine image bearers, in possession of divinely conferred human dignity. The view that Western values are faith-free and that they come to full fruition only with the advent of secular humanism ignores completely their historical origin in Christianity and the crucial place of respect for life within that perspective. So I would level a countercharge. It is precisely under the umbrella of secular humanism that Western values have become vulnerable, and principally because of their abandonment of the sacredness of human life. The proprietary claims of secular humanism over Western values is all the more remarkable when you consider that the notion of universal human dignity and respect for life are not rationally deducible from human data alone. There is nothing obvious or self-evident about them, such that one might reasonably expect them inevitably to emerge. As a matter of historical fact, they did not result from unaided rational reflection. Rather, they arose in the context of reason enlarged by faith. They are essentially, in other words, Christian ideas. The default position of fallen human nature before the arrival of Christianity was, and for many remains, tribalism. That is, those unrelated to us by blood, nation, or favour are either inferior or the enemy, or both. Tribalism, of course, takes many different forms, many less than obvious. The dangers of technology. Even for ancient Greeks, altruism was elitist, conditioned and constrained by attitudes associated with fatalism, militarism, hierarchy, slavery, and xenophobia. Everybody to the geographic west of Greece was considered a barbarian, incapable of proper political existence in a city, a prerequisite, according to Aristotle, for properly functioning political animals to flourish. The 2nd century Roman jurist Gaius explained that The 2nd century Roman jurist Gaius explained that there were 3 tests whereby a man's status was to be established. Was he free or unfree? Was he a citizen or was he a foreigner? Was he a pater familias or a subject? These tests, he thought, were enough to tell not simply where someone stood in the social pecking order, but whether they were worth anything at all. It's true that slaves could hold high office, but they were still effectively non-persons. And though less restricted, a woman's status and value were entirely dependent on the men in her life. The rights and privileges of Roman law were applicable only to men, and much the same judgments were made in practically every empire of the ancient world. It was only the introduction of Christianity's belief in universal human dignity and absolute respect for human life that offered an alternative view, a view that transformed the ancient world and bequeathed to the modern world what we now call Western values. Secular humanism, on the other hand, remains an inadequate guardian of Western values because the core belief that earths them is not rationally available to secular humanism, even if some secular humanists happen, as a matter of fact, to share it. By its very nature and perforce, secular humanism is limited to the political and practical spheres, functioning, as it were, on the surface of life, without any account of life's ultimate meaning or its value and purpose. Even when it affirms human dignity or equality or any kind of moral universalism, it is unable to offer a rational defense of these commitments as moral absolutes. On the contrary, abortion to term, assisted suicide and euthanasia are all perfectly consistent with the tenets of secular humanism. Some respected secular ethicists now seriously argue for the non-human status of mentally disabled infants, or postnatal termination, as it is euphemistically called, and even for elective euthanasia for healthy individuals. These all now fall within the law of many Western democracies. If asked to name the core Western value, many, unsurprisingly, would point to personal autonomy. So, for instance, Lord Neuberger, the former president of the UK Supreme Court, recently said, "There are many important human rights. In the end, however, they can all be encapsulated in a single overriding right, the right to personal autonomy." But without Christianity, even personal autonomy is in danger. Indeed, and paradoxically, most of the positive convictions of secular humanism can be sustained only by the Christian faith commitments from which they originated. Only Christianity affords a sufficiently robust foundation for the core values of Western civilization, and any argument for Western values that dismisses the vital role of Christianity is in the perilous position of one sawing away at the very branch on which they find themselves sitting. So let me draw some conclusions. Our world has much in common with the world into which Christianity came. The Hellenistic age was called by one of the great scholars of the period, E.R. Dodd, an age of anxiety. It was an age of rapid change in a vastly expanded, impersonal world, resulting from the conquest of Alexander the Great, which saw the weakening and eventual collapse of the close-knit ties of life in small city-states. Alexander's empire, stretching from Greece to Afghanistan, was the first hint of the globalized world in which we now find ourselves. Christianity brought a transformation of human consciousness into that world, into a world desperately in need of a new self-understanding. And the same is true of our world, to which the same moniker was given in the 20th century by the English poet W.H. Auden in the longest of his works, The Age of Anxiety. That transformation, which is more restoration than transformation, can come only from the originating source of Western civilization. Secular humanism, on the other hand, by normalizing through legislation the worthlessness of some human lives, while at the same time offering hollow support for the notion of human dignity and heavily qualified respect for life, puts Western values and Western civilization at risk. If the law cannot guarantee my life in the womb and or in the hospital bed, it follows inexorably that pragmatic and economic criteria for judging worth and conferring the right of inviolability will at some stage almost inevitably be changed, so that the law will no longer guarantee my life in between my birth and my death. The rule of law itself depends on the absolute value attributed to human life. When law is uncoupled from the higher court of natural justice, against which all laws are to be judged, the rule of law has ended, and Western civilization will be no more. Now, to a greater extent than we are prepared ever to admit, we make the destiny that makes us. The responsibility lies with each of us to understand the world as it was, as it is, and as it can be. There cannot be a better world without better human persons. But to become better human persons, it's necessary, though not sufficient, to understand better what it is to be human. Christianity critically offered an account of what it is to be human that drew on the best of ancient insights about human flourishing, but complemented that necessarily limited view by adding a dimension known only to faith, albeit aided and abetted by reason. A new dimension that gave rise to the foundational value at the core of Western civilization, and without which Western values are dangerously vulnerable. Western civilization is premised on the conviction that our lives are not pointless or without value. It's founded on the conviction that we are not lonely, isolated egos adrift in an alien universe, accidents of cosmic history, devoid of meaning and purpose. It is premised on the belief that the true adornments of human nature are our innate need for and attraction to truth, beauty, and goodness, and above all, our God-given capacity for selfless love of the good, of one another, and of the Creator himself. These, and these alone, are what make possible all that we value most in this life. Thank you. Yes, of course.
Muchas gracias, Fray Albán. Si alguno en el público desea hacer una pregunta o comentario, este es el momento. Podemos hacerles acercar el micro. ¿Hay alguna pregunta? Yo en lo personal tengo una pregunta. Fray Albán, does the artificial intelligence have an impact in our values? The artificial intelligence. Oh, sorry, I have an...
Should I? Thank you.
Whether it does or not remains to be seen. That it can is certain. And it can only, I think, have a damaging influence if we forget what it is to be human. Because all the things about AI which make it so dangerous are those emulations of human nature that are only that. They're not actually human. They're not actually the expressions of a human nature.
Thank you. Un aplauso, por favor. Bueno, antes del descanso vamos a tomarnos una foto con todos, ¿cierto? Genial.